Welcome to the Green Dolphin Science Channel, and thank you for tuning in.
Great to be here.
Today, we're diving deep into a really fascinating study from northern Thailand.
Yes, it looks at heavy metal contamination, specifically in chicken and duck eggs near an old gold mine.
And you shared this research with us because, well, you're interested in understanding how our environment impacts our food sources, right? And the potential health risks involved.
Exactly.
So our mission today is to unpack this research. We want to pull out the key insights about the presence and potential ecological risks of certain heavy metals.
We're talking mercury or Hg, which we know can be a nasty neurotoxin.
Right.
Lead, Pb, which affects development, cadmium, Cd, and also manganese.
And we'll be looking at how these metals sort of build up in different kinds of poultry chickens, ducks, and their eggs, comparing areas near the mine versus further away.
Yeah, the contaminated versus uncontaminated zones, essentially.
Okay, so before we get into the results, maybe some background. Gold mining in Thailand.
Right. Context is key here. So the biggest gold mining area in Thailand, it operated from about 2001 to 2016.
Okay.
Mostly in northern provinces like Phuket, Phitsanulok, place like that.
And even though it stopped in 2016.
Well, that's the thing with heavy metals. They're non-biodegradable. They don't just break down and go away.
They stick around.
Exactly. So the waste from gold mining, it typically contains mercury, lead, cadmium, manganese, and these can, leach into the water, the soil, even get into the air.
And we know this is a real risk, don't we? It's not just theoretical.
Oh, definitely. Previous studies globally have shown pretty high ecological risk from heavy metals, especially mercury, in soils near gold mines.
But what makes this particular study interesting?
Well, while we have the general picture, there hasn't been much research looking specifically at poultry contamination around the Thai gold mines.
Which is important because...
Because Thailand is a big egg exporter.
Yeah.
And Phuket province, where the mine was, has loads of laying hens and ducks. And importantly, a lot of those ducks are free-grazing.
So they're roaming around more.
Precisely. And there was an older study, actually, in central and western Thailand that found higher lead and cadmium in duck eggs from big commercial farms compared to, small backyard or free-grazing ones.
Interesting. So this new study homes in on the gold mine area itself.
Yes. And their main idea, the hypothesis, was kind of what you'd expect. That the free-grazing ducks, because they're out foraging in the environment more, would probably pick up higher levels of these heavy metals.
Okay, makes sense. So building on that idea, how did they actually set up the study? What did they measure?
So they designed it as a comparison. They looked at heavy metal levels in, everything relevant. The birds ate, soil on the farms, the water they drank.
Okay.
And they did this for 3 different farm types. Regular laying hens, confined laying ducks, and then those free-grazing ducks we mentioned.
And they compared near the mine versus far away.
That's right. They defined contaminated as less than 25 kilometers from the mine, thinking about, dust and water runoff range.
Gotcha.
And uncontaminated as farms more than 25 kilometers away. They took samples from 23 different farms 3 times during 2019.
Quite thorough.
Yes. Eggs, soil, water, feed. Plus, they use questionnaires to get details on farming practices, water sources, things like that.
All right, so a lot of data collected.
Yeah.
What did they actually find? Let's get to the results, especially the heavy metals in the eggs themselves. That's the bit we eat, after all.
Okay, so the egg results showed some really clear differences. For mercury, this is a key finding. Levels were significantly higher in the eggs from free-grazing ducks.
Compared to the others.
Compared to both the laying hens and the confined laying ducks. And interestingly, this was true in both the contaminated area near the mine and the uncontaminated area further away.
Whoa, okay, so for mercury, being a free-grazing duck seems to be the biggest factor, more so than just proximity to the mine.
It really points that way. It strongly suggests their lifestyle, their foraging behavior, leads to more mercury exposure somehow.
That's a major takeaway right there. What about lead and manganese? Was it the same pattern?
No, lead and manganese were different. For those two, they did find significantly higher levels in the eggs of both laying ducks and free-grazing ducks compared to the hens.
Okay.
But specifically in the contaminated area, the one closer to the mine.
So for lead and manganese, proximity does seem to matter more for the ducks.
It looks like it, yes. It supports the idea that the mine environment is influencing those particular metals in the ducks.
And cadmium. That's another one we worry about.
Cadmium was the odd one out, actually. They found no significant difference in egg cadmium levels.
Yeah.
Not between the farm types, not between the contaminated and uncontaminated areas.
Huh. So cadmium exposure or uptake seems to work differently for these birds.
It suggests that, yeah, the pathways might be different compared to mercury, lead, and manganese.
Okay, so we're seeing distinct patterns in the eggs depending on the metal, the bird type, and location. But what about the sources? Did they find higher levels in the feed, soil, or water near the mine, or on the duck farms?
This is where it gets really interesting and maybe a bit counterintuitive. They found that the concentrations of mercury, lead, cadmium, and manganese in the actual feed samples, the soil samples, and the water samples were not significantly different across the 3 farm types in either area.
Wait, really? So the overall environmental levels they measured weren't that different between the farms?
Not significantly, no, which is a crucial point. It strongly suggests that it's not just about the background level in the soil or water nearby.
It's more about how the birds interact with that environment.
Exactly. The type of farming practice, free-grazing versus confined, seems to be a much bigger driver of the contamination levels ending up in the eggs than just the bulk environmental samples alone showed.
That's fascinating. It really emphasizes the animal's behavior. Did the study suggest why that might be?
It did offer some potential reasons. They noted, for instance, that most laying hens in both areas got tap water.
Okay, cleaner source probably.
Probably. Whereas the laying ducks and the free-grazing ducks often use water from canals, which were near agricultural fields.
Ah, so potentially more runoff, more exposure routes there.
Likely, yes. That difference in water source, plus just the general wider access to the environment for ducks, especially free-grazing ones, it just gives them more chances to pick up heavy metals.
Makes sense. They cover more ground, eat more varied stuff, potentially including contaminated soil or insects.
Precisely. And they also mention one other thing for manganese specifically.
What was that?
Apparently, it's common practice on duck farms to add vitamin and mineral supplements to the drinking water, and these often contain manganese.
Ah, so that could directly boost manganese levels in the duck eggs?
It could certainly contribute, yeah. Another factor related to this specific farming practice.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly. Did they look inside the egg? Like, where did these metals actually end up? Yolk or white?
They did. They analyzed the yolk and the albumin in the egg white separately. They found that mercury and cadmium tended to concentrate mainly in the albumin, the egg white.
Okay.
Whereas lead and manganese were found mostly in the egg yolk.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Is that typical for birds?
Yes, these findings generally line up with other studies on heavy metals in bird eggs. Different metals seem to favor different parts of the egg, which, has implications for exposure depending on how people eat eggs.
Right. If you only eat egg whites or only yolks, though most people eat the whole thing. Okay, now the study also did an ecological risk assessment on the soil itself. What did that show? Was the soil dangerous?
Well, they use something called the ecological risk factor, the ER. It helps gauge the potential harm to the ecosystem.
And what did it find?
For mercury and lead, the risk in the soil was considered low, but for cadmium, the ER indicated a considerable to high environmental risk.
Across all the farms.
Pretty much across all the farm types they looked at, yeah. Which is concerning. It suggests cadmium might be a more widespread soil issue in that region.
That is surprising, especially since the egg cadmium levels weren't that different. Was the risk higher near the mine?
This is maybe the most surprising part. The highest ecological risk for cadmium in the soil, it was actually found in the laying duck farms in the uncontaminated area.
Wait, the ones further from the mine had the highest soil cadmium risk.
According to the ER assessment, yes. It was rated as high ecological risk there.
Wow. Okay, that definitely suggests something else besides the mine is contributing to soil cadmium.
Absolutely. It points towards other potential sources.
So what about the overall risk, considering all the metals together? They use an index for that, right? The RI.
Yes, the Potential Ecological Risk Index, or RI. It combines the risks from all the metals they studied. That index suggested a moderate risk overall for all the farms in both areas.
Okay, moderate overall. But that high cadmium risk, especially away from the mine, still stands out. Did they have ideas why? You mentioned agriculture earlier.
Yes, they specifically linked it to agricultural practices. They noted these uncontaminated duck farms were often located near agricultural land.
And farming adds cadmium.
It can, yeah. It's pretty well known that phosphate fertilizers, which are widely used in agriculture, can contain cadmium as an impurity. Over time, this can build up in the soil.
I see. So we might be looking at a situation where the mine impacts lead and manganese nearby, especially in ducks, but agricultural practices could be driving a more widespread cadmium issue in the soil.
That seems to be what the data suggests. The soil risk assessment, particularly for cadmium, doesn't perfectly match the egg contamination patterns.
Yeah.
It really highlights how complex these pathways are, how metals move from the environment into the food chain. It's definitely not always a straight line.
Okay, so pulling all these threads together, what are the main implications? What should we take away from this research?
Well, a few key things. First, it seems consuming eggs from free-grazing ducks carries the highest potential risk for mercury, lead, and manganese contamination, especially if they're near the mine.
So the type of farming really matters for exposure.
It does, and following from that, the study suggests the egg type itself, hen, laying duck, free-grazing duck, could actually be used as a kind of bioindicator.
Like a canary in a coal mine, but with eggs.
Sort of, yeah. Monitoring those free-grazing duck farms could be a really useful long-term strategy for keeping tabs on heavy metal risk, both in the local environment and in the food chain.
That's practical. What else?
That high ecological risk from cadmium in the soil, particularly popping up strongly in those uncontaminated duck farms near agricultural land, that definitely needs more investigation. We need to better understand those agricultural sources.
Right. Pinpointing the source of that cadmium seems crucial.
And finally, the researchers point out that all this data is valuable. It can help develop better public health monitoring and maybe control strategies, especially for communities living near current or former mining areas.
Okay, let's try and summarize what this all means for you, the listener. This research gives us a really fascinating snapshot, doesn't it?
It does. It shows how these historical mining activities can have these long shadows, impacting the environment and our food long after the digging stops.
And the big difference in metal levels based on how the birds are farmed,
Right.
especially the higher levels in those free-grazing ducks, that really drives home how important understanding these pathways is.
Then you have that other layer, right, where it gets really interesting. That finding about cadmium posing a, considerable to high ecological risk in the soil pretty much everywhere they looked,
Yeah.
with the highest risk surprisingly far from the mine on those duck farms near agricultural land. That throws a spotlight on broader environmental sources, maybe linked to farming.
It shows the impact isn't just a neat circle around the mine.
Exactly. So what this really boils down to is, yes, gold mining seems to have a clear localized effect, especially for things like lead and manganese in poultry that roam around. But other widespread activities, like maybe certain types of agriculture, could be contributing significantly to other contamination issues, like cadmium in the soil over a much wider area. It shows how tangled up environmental health and food safety really are.
So this deep dive really reveals that just measuring metal levels in the soil or water isn't the whole story.
Not at all. You absolutely have to understand the animal's behavior, the specific farming methods, to get a real handle on the potential risks to us as consumers.
So maybe something for you to think about further. What other kinds of environmental contaminants, besides heavy metals, might build up differently depending on how our food is produced?
That's a great question. And how can we develop monitoring strategies that are smart enough to actually capture these different complex pathways?
Lots to think about there.
Indeed. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into heavy metal contamination in Thailand.
Yes, thank you. We hope this has given you some valuable insights and maybe sparked some new questions.
We look forward to you tuning in next time for another in-depth exploration right here on Green Dolphin Science.